Yesterday, the Business Council of Alberta released a letter calling on the federal government to improve its regulatory processes for reviewing and approving large infrastructure projects. So I'm going to talk to Scott Crockatt, who's the VP of Communications and External Affairs, about that letter. So welcome to the interview, Scott.
Thanks, Markham. Thrilled to be here.
Look, give me a brief overview of what the letter's about and who the intended audience is.
Absolutely. So yesterday we were really pleased to be part of a coalition, a cross-country coalition that put together this joint letter. The coalition includes Indigenous groups, environmental groups, even labor, business and policy groups from coast to coast in Canada, all collectively saying the same thing, which is it's an offer of a hand in partnership to the federal government to say Canada needs to build big major projects. We need to do it to hit our environmental goals, our economic goals, even our Indigenous reconciliation goals. And to do that, to build these big major projects that we need to improve our regulatory system. And we, the signatories of this letter, these groups from coast to coast, stand ready to do that in partnership with you, federal government. And that we're really encouraged that that's been well received because, frankly, this is a priority for the federal government themselves. They included it in their most recent budget, saying that they've given themselves until the end of this year to develop really a fulsome plan to improve regulatory. And this is the rest of Canadian sort of civil society coming together and saying, we want to work with you on that.
Okay, let's get into the meat here because I'm looking at the list of areas you gave it as an example. I'm sure this is not an exhaustive list, but we'll go through it. And what I'm seeing is that many of these are exclusively provincial jurisdiction. So critical minerals is mostly provincial. Power generation is entirely provincial. Transmission within the province is provincial. Across provincial borders is federal. Hydrogen manufacturing, provincial. Export capacity, again, federal. Low carbon energy like wind and solar, provincial. Small modular reactors, there's a nuclear commission that does that kind of regulation. So fair enough, federal there. But probably 60% of what I just mentioned here is actually provincial legislation and probably 100% provincial. And so I don't know what role, how the federal government doesn't regulate in those areas.
You're right, Markham, that many of those areas are under provincial jurisdiction. But the reality is when building major projects, there's a number of ways that this intersects with the federal government. The first is actually a surprising number of the types of projects that you described do intersect federal jurisdiction. I'll give you one just very specific example that almost any project that intersects with a waterway is eventually going to intersect as well with the Department of Fishery and Oceans, a federal department. And those permits, which often come very late in a project process, are actually one of the key areas that we've identified that can be one of the delaying factors. The other thing that I'd say to you is when we've talked to, and part of doing the background work behind this was talking to all kinds of groups like those mentioned who are signatories to the letter, as well as project proponents, when they talk about their real sort of pain points, most of it actually does involve federal regulatory processes. And as you'll be aware, through some federal mechanisms, such as the Impact Assessment Act, it is possible that the federal government can designate a program under the Act to be reviewed at that federal level. And so, and I'll give you one more example where these projects intersect with federal jurisdiction. And finally, that's the risk of, quote, dreaming small. That if project proponents try and craft their projects to just stay only within provincial jurisdiction, then Canada is really going to miss out on the opportunities, frankly, the energy transition opportunities, the decarbonization opportunities that come with big major projects that do have to intersect federal jurisdiction in all those ways that I've just described.
Okay, and that's fair enough. That's actually a pretty good answer because I've argued for a long time we need more federal leadership around this. The problem is that now with the process you've just described, not only requires the federal government to look at its own regulatory processes, but it has to work with the provinces. The provinces have to come to the table. And I can tell you, many of my viewers will know that I'm like 4 or 5 months deep into an investigative report on the Alberta Energy Regulator and how oil and gas is regulated in Alberta. And if you go back to 2013, when the province brought in the Responsible Energy Development Act and created the Alberta Energy Regulator as it is today, and the whole point of it was to do exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about in oil and gas, and it's blew up spectacularly in its face. I mean, we now have this dysfunctional regulator. We have an industry that's got 80, 90,000 orphan wells. Has become a mess. And my point here is, when you call for changes, beware the law of unintended consequences.
I will agree with you on the law of unintended consequences. And I will point out, I don't necessarily agree, although I'm not as deep into your own reporting on it, about the state of the Alberta Energy Regulator. But I will say that unintended consequences has been one of the major themes that's come up as we've done some of this work. And one sort of area that I would point to with that is to say that, and this is, I think, really critical about this letter and the advocacy around it, is to say that we can't cut any corners in the process of doing this. So, while we're talking about improving regulatory processes and speeding up regulatory processes, getting things built more quickly, one of the very first things that just about everyone has brought up and that we believe very clearly in is that can't involve any sort of cutting a corner on something environmental or on the essential nature of Indigenous engagement. Really, this has to be a way that we can improve these processes without giving anything up on the side of safety, environmental, Indigenous, and all these other imperatives that Canadians really, really believe in.
Okay, so what you're telling me, I want to clarify here, is this is not the business community and I suppose Indigenous communities saying we want to cut back on the gatekeepers on the Canadian regulatory process so that we can hurry up and build all this stuff and attract capital. It is not that.
Absolutely, it's not. It is not the idea that we need to cut back on any level of rigor that's involved, but there are a number of really pragmatic ideas that we've come up with, and later this week we'll actually be launching kind of a full report that details those ideas really specifically, and many of these ideas can be implemented likely without substantial need for regulatory change or really transformational new ways of doing things. Some of them are really quite simple. And, to give you some examples, there's the opportunity that we could be doing things that are currently happening in sequence. We could be doing them concurrently, for instance. Or you brought up the provincial federal regulatory interplay. We would agree entirely that provinces and the feds need to work together to make these kind of major projects happen. One area where that is really fruitful and rife with opportunity is in the area of substituting each other's reviews. So you may be familiar that this has recently happened in British Columbia, where British Columbia put their hand up and said to the federal government, "Hi, we'd like you to use our environmental review process for the Cedar LNG facility, the partnership between Pembina and the Haisla First Nation." And the federal government said, "Okay, that sounds good to us." Used BC's environmental review and took it as their own. This is kind of the one project, one window, one review approach, and is a great example of not reducing any rigor, but being able to take some of the bulk out of the process.
And I'm back to the Alberta Energy Regulator and the Responsible Energy Development Act, because while that might work really well in BC, it will not work really well, in my opinion, in Alberta. I will say this: I've been under the hood of the act and the regulator now for a long time, and I've talked to lots of experts. And instead of getting the Ferrari that I thought Alberta thinks it has, it's a 1976 Chevy with about 300,000 miles on it, and it doesn't work really well. So the idea that Alberta might put up its hand and say, "Hey, we want you to take our environmental," I would object to that as if I was an Alberta citizen, I would be going, no, it needs to go the other way, because at least then it will be done properly. So, and Saskatchewan's got the similar kind of problem. Ontario's got some problems. And so I guess what I'm getting at here is, if we have an issue with regulatory processes, it really makes sense to bring everybody to the table, and the provinces have to look in the mirror and go, maybe we need to change too. Maybe we can improve the way we do things. Would you agree or disagree?
Well, I certainly agree with a portion of that, which is that if the province, want their regulatory processes to be substituted for those at the federal level, then there is going to have to be a meeting of the minds, and that's probably going to be different depending on which province we're talking about, because there are some regional differences in how these processes work and the kinds of projects that they're working on. I will, though, stress for you, Markham, that most of the major challenges that we've heard are at the federal level, not necessarily with the provincial regulators. So I'm certainly actually very hopeful that we'll see more happening in the future of what we've recently seen in BC of this, one project, one window, one review kind of approach. That is going to involve absolutely a little bit of compromise and working together between provinces and the federal government for sure.
Okay, fair enough. We want to beat this poor horse to death. So let's go on to the idea of what are people telling you, and what has been the response in Ottawa to the letter, and in particular, if you've had any response from provincial entities about the letter.
Well, first off, Markham, I'll mention that I'm dialing in with you today from our nation's capital, where we're meeting with a wide variety of folks, including a lot of senior ministries, talking about the content of this letter. And I can tell you, it's been extremely positively received, across the board. The first thing I'd say is this is responding to an offer that the federal government put out there. If I'm sure you're familiar with it, but in this year's 2023 budget, the federal government themselves said, it just can't take 12 years to build a critical minerals mine. And in many ways, it may actually be taking longer than that. And one of the things that this letter says, and that there's broad agreement with, is at our current pace, we're not going to be able to permit, let alone build, the kinds of transformational things that we need to hit our 2030 targets in particular, and then later than that, net zero targets. And I can tell you honestly, there's almost no pushback on this idea in general that our regulatory systems need to be better, need to be quicker. Otherwise, we're going to miss our own objectives. I will say, in fairness, one thing that people bring up is they'll say our systems are maybe not as bad as you've heard. And I think that very much can be the case. A lot of improvement has happened in our regulatory systems, and just because we have challenges in ours doesn't mean there aren't challenges elsewhere as well. One of the places that a lot of folks would look to would be the United States, which has, between the Inflation Reduction Act and the proposal for a maximum 2-year environmental review on certain types of projects, they're really making some aggressive bets in this area. However, it's only fair to say that the United States also has plenty of interjurisdictional and regulatory challenges of their own, also, between states. So I'll tell you that this has been really, really, really well received in Ottawa, and kind of well received by the Canadian community as well. Since launching this letter, we've heard from other groups who have said, hey, can we add our signature to this after the fact? And we've said, absolutely, yes. We believe that, Markham, I hope you're feeling this, because I know you spent a long time on this, that there's a bit of a moment of convergence around this issue, when a lot of groups who maybe previously felt a little bit differently about it, or were skeptical of development, or were approaching this with some caution, are now saying, no, you know what? Canada needs to be a place that can get big things built. We've got to do it for our environmental and our economic goals. Let's get together and figure out how we can get it done.
You know what? And that's an absolutely fair argument, Scott, because as you know, many viewers will know, I've been reporting about the energy transition for the better part of a decade, and have been complaining. Nobody's paying attention to this. And now that people are paying attention to this, I've got to, be careful, where I step. Now, having said all of that, I agree with you in principle. I have been cautious in this interview, in my comments, because I'm trying. Well, I may have sounded critical. I mean to inject a note of caution.
Sure.
In that, having watched regulatory review process reviews before, both at the federal level, seen it now at the Alberta level, and reported on it in other provinces, this has to be approached, and the attitude is right, and the idea of building a coalition, about collaborating, is absolutely the right way to go. Just get it right, because if you get it wrong, you create more problems than you solve. So that's, I guess, where I would leave the discussion. Good luck with to you and your organization and everybody else who's participating in this. I hope that you get what you're looking for, and we'll talk to you in the future again about the kind of progress you're making.
Thank you, Markham. Talk to you again.